Sarah Parker had always been the kind of girl people in small towns whispered about, not because of anything she did, at least not back then, but because of her looks. She was strikingly beautiful with dark hair that fell in loose waves past her shoulders and green eyes that seemed to reflect the sunlight. In her small Georgia town of Willow Creek, where nothing much ever changed, Sarah's beauty was often the subject of idle gossip. Some said she took after her mother, a woman who had passed away when Sarah was only 8, leaving her in the care of her father, Richard Parker. Richard, a quiet and hard-working man in his late 40s, had done his best to raise Sarah after her mother's death. A mechanic by trade, he had spent his life working long hours at the local auto shop to ensure that Sarah had everything she needed. But despite his best efforts, there was always a distance between father and daughter, an emotional chasm that neither could quite bridge. Richard had been left broken by his wife's sudden passing, and although he loved Sarah, his grief had manifested in the form of rigid control and strict expectations. He was determined that Sarah would go to college, get out of Willow Creek, and live a life far better than his own. But Sarah had never shared her father's ambitions. She didn't want to leave the only place she had ever known, and the thought of college filled her with dread. Her grades in high school had been decent, though not remarkable, and she had little interest in further education. Sarah had spent most of her teenage years feeling suffocated by the weight of her father's expectations. Though she smiled and went through the motions of daily life, a growing restlessness simmered just beneath the surface. To the outside world, the Parkers seemed like a perfectly normal family. Richard was a respected figure in town, known for his hard work and quiet demeanor. Sarah, though aloof and somewhat reserved, was well liked, and her beauty often turned heads wherever she went. But those who looked a little closer would notice the cracks in their facade, the long silences at the dinner table, the way Richard's eyes darkened whenever someone mentioned Sarah's future, the quiet arguments that erupted behind closed doors late at night. Then there was Mr. Thompson, their neighbor. Edward Thompson was a 60-year-old widower who had lived next door to the Parkers for as long as Sarah could remember. His wife had passed away several years ago after a long battle with cancer, leaving him alone in a large, old house that had once been filled with life. Mr. Thompson was a quiet man, much like Richard, though he had an air of warmth and kindness that Richard often lacked. He had once been a close friend of the Parker family, especially during the years after Sarah's mother had passed away. He had helped Richard with repairs around the house and had often brought Sarah small gifts, books, flowers, anything to cheer her up. As Sarah grew older, her relationship with Mr. Thompson changed. What had once been an innocent bond between a young girl and her neighbor began to shift into something more complex, something neither of them fully understood at first. He became a confidant, someone she could talk to about her frustrations with her father, her fear of the future, and her sense of being trapped in a life she didn't want. Mr. Thompson, for his part, had always been fond of Sarah. He saw in her a reflection of his younger self, someone yearning for something more, something different. Over time, his fondness deepened into a kind of quiet longing that he kept hidden beneath a facade of neighborly concern. He didn't dare admit it to himself, let alone to anyone else, but he found himself looking forward to her visits in a way that felt dangerous. The affair, if it could be called that in the beginning, started slowly. A lingering touch on the arm, a shared glance that lasted too long, innocent moments that carried a weight neither of them could ignore. Sarah had never known anyone who listened to her the way Mr. Thompson did. He made her feel understood in a way that her father never could, and so what began as conversations over the fence turned into something much deeper, something they both knew was wrong, but couldn't stop. At first, they were careful. Their meetings were brief, always casual enough to avoid suspicion, but as the weeks passed, Sarah found herself seeking out Mr. Thompson more frequently. She would go for walks in the evenings, slipping out after her father had fallen asleep, and end up at his doorstep. They would sit together on his porch, talking in hushed tones about everything and nothing. It was during one of these late-night visits that their relationship crossed an unspoken line. It was a warm summer night, the air heavy with the scent of jasmine and the hum of cicadas. Sarah had knocked on Mr. Thompson's door, her heart pounding in her chest, though she couldn't explain why. When he opened the door, there was a moment of silence between them, an electric charge that neither could deny. He stepped aside to let her in, and as she walked past him, their hands brushed, sending a jolt of energy through her. They didn't speak for a long while, sitting side by side on the couch, the tension between them thick and palpable. And then, without thinking, Sarah leaned in and kissed him. It was soft and tentative, as if testing the waters. For a brief moment, Mr. Thompson didn't respond. He froze, his mind racing, torn between what he knew was right and what he so desperately wanted. But then he kissed her back. That kiss ignited something in both of them, something they had been trying to suppress for months. From that moment on, their relationship took on a new intensity. They met more often, always in secret, always under the cover of darkness. Sarah felt alive in a way she had never felt before. She knew what they were doing was wrong, but she couldn't stop herself. Being with Mr. Thompson made her forget, if only for a little while, the crushing weight of her father's expectations and the suffocating smallness of her life. Yet as their secret affair deepened, so too did the tension at home. Richard had always been protective of Sarah, but now his protectiveness took on a more paranoid edge. He had begun to notice the way she would slip out of the house late at night, the way she seemed distant and distracted during the day. He didn't know where she was going or who she was with, but he suspected something was amiss. Around this time, Richard had also come into a large inheritance after the sudden death of his estranged brother. The money, which amounted to more than Richard had ever imagined, should have been a blessing, but instead, it only added to his growing anxiety. He felt the eyes of the town on him, watching, waiting for him to make a mistake. Richard had never been good with money, and the responsibility weighed heavily on him. He became more withdrawn, more irritable, and his relationship with Sarah deteriorated even further. The money also created an invisible rift between Richard and Mr. Thompson. Though they had once been close friends, Richard began to pull away, convinced that everyone around him, Mr. Thompson included, was eyeing his newfound wealth with envy. He started locking up important documents, obsessing over who he could trust. The friendly dinners and conversations over beers that had once defined their friendship became a thing of the past. Unbeknownst to Richard, the tension between him and Mr. Thompson was about far more than money. Sarah, caught between her father's growing paranoia and the forbidden relationship she was trying to keep secret, began to feel the pressure mounting. She knew it was only a matter of time before something broke. Every time she and Mr. Thompson met, she was filled with a sense of both excitement and dread. They were careful, so careful, but she could feel the walls closing in. Her father's suspicion was growing, and Mr. Thompson's increasingly erratic behavior made her uneasy. He would talk in cryptic terms about his past, mentioning debts and dangers, but always stopping short of explaining. And then, one evening, everything changed. Richard had been out late, meeting with a lawyer about the inheritance. When he returned home, he noticed something unusual, a light on in Mr. Thompson's house. He had seen that light on before, late at night, and it had always made him uneasy. It was in those moments that he felt a nagging suspicion, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. He sat in his car for a long time, staring at the light in Mr. Thompson's window, the pieces slowly coming together in his mind. And then, in a flash of clarity, he understood. As the weeks passed, the relationship between Sarah and Mr. Thompson became more dangerous, more intense, and far more difficult to conceal. What had once been brief, secretive glances and quiet conversations over the backyard fence had evolved into something that consumed them both. Their encounters grew more frequent, and each meeting left them craving more. They were careful, but no matter how cautious they tried to be, the weight of their secret began to hang over them like a dark cloud, threatening to break at any moment. Sarah found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, wondering if someone had noticed the way she slipped out of the house late at night or the way she lingered a little too long by the front gate. It felt like the world was watching, even if no one had said anything. Yet, her father, Richard, became more suspicious by the day. Though he never directly confronted her, she could feel his eyes on her, always watching, always scrutinizing her every move. Richard, for his part, was trapped in his own growing paranoia. His mind was a whirlpool of suspicion and doubt, and the more he tried to push the thoughts away, the more they gnawed at him. The discovery of the light in Mr. Thompson's house the fateful night had sent him spiraling. He hadn't wanted to believe it, hadn't wanted to think that his neighbor, his old friend, would betray him in such a way. But the signs were all there: Sarah's increasing distance, her late-night disappearances, the way she seemed to smile more when Thompson's name was mentioned. He began staying up late, pretending to be asleep when Sarah would sneak out, following her with silent footsteps as she made her way to Mr. Thompson's house. Each time, his blood boiled hotter, but still, he didn't confront her. Richard had always been a man who prized control above all else, and he didn't want to act without certainty. He told himself that he needed more proof, that he needed to catch them in the act. The inheritance had only added fuel to the fire, feeding his growing distrust. He knew there were people in town who eyed his newfound wealth with envy, and the idea that Thompson, of all people, might be trying to manipulate his daughter to get to the money was unbearable. The paranoia twisted inside him like a snake. It became all he could think about, consuming his thoughts during the day and haunting his dreams at night. He started to see threats everywhere, not just from Thompson, but from anyone who dared speak to Sarah. He watched as she chatted with boys from school, her laughter too bright, her gaze too warm. He scrutinized her every interaction, convinced that someone, somewhere, was plotting against him. But for Sarah, the world outside of her home felt like a reprieve from the suffocating tension between her and her father. She could see the change in Richard, the way his eyes narrowed whenever she came home late, the way his mouth tightened when she asked to go out with friends. He never said anything directly, but his silence was worse than his words. It filled the house like poison, seeping into every corner, every conversation. She and Mr. Thompson had become bolder, though, despite her father's growing suspicions. Their late-night meetings became more frequent, more desperate. The stolen moments they shared felt like a lifeline for Sarah, something that tethered her to a world outside her father's suffocating expectations. But with every visit to Mr. Thompson's house, Sarah's nerves frayed a little more. She started to feel as though someone was always watching, though she couldn't prove it. One night, as they sat on Mr. Thompson's porch, the air thick with the scent of magnolias, Sarah felt the familiar gnaw of anxiety in her chest. Mr. Thompson was talking softly, his hand resting gently on hers, but she couldn't focus on his words. She kept glancing over her shoulder, her skin prickling with the sense that someone was nearby. "Are you even listening?" Mr. Thompson asked, his voice breaking through her thoughts. Sarah shook her head, offering him a small, apologetic smile. "I'm sorry," she whispered, glancing down at her lap. I keep feeling like someone's watching us." Mr. Thompson frowned, his hand tightening around hers. "No one's watching, Sarah," he said softly. "We're careful. No one knows." But deep down, Sarah wasn't so sure. The nights felt darker now, the silence heavier, and each step she took toward Mr. Thompson's house felt like it was drawing her closer to something inevitable. She began to wonder how much longer they could continue like this before something, or someone, shattered the fragile world they had built around their secret. Richard's suspicions continued to grow. One night, after following Sarah once again to Mr. Thompson's house, he made up his mind. He would confront them once and for all, but as he approached the house, something stopped him. He hovered outside, just beyond the reach of the porch light, watching as Sarah and Mr. Thompson sat together, their heads closed, their voices low. He saw the way Mr. Thompson's hand lingered on Sarah's arm, the way her eyes softened when she looked at him, and then, before his very eyes, they kissed. The sight sent a jolt of white-hot fury through Richard's veins. His fists clenched at his sides, his teeth grinding together as he watched them. It took every ounce of self-control he had not to charge up the steps and tear Mr. Thompson away from his daughter. But he held back, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. He needed more time, more evidence. In the days that followed, Richard became obsessed with tracking their movements. He began taking note of every time Sarah left the house, every time she glanced in the direction of Mr. Thompson's home. His paranoia consumed him. He could feel the betrayal festering inside him, and with each passing day, his resentment toward Mr. Thompson grew more intense. He also became increasingly erratic in his behavior. Sarah noticed the way he began locking the front door earlier in the evenings, as though trying to keep her inside. She noticed how he started keeping the curtains drawn at all times, as if he were trying to shut out the world. His temper, once kept in check, began to flare more frequently, and their conversations turned into tense, silent battles. "Where were you last night?" Richard asked one evening, his voice unnervingly calm as they sat across from each other at the dinner table. "I was out with friends," Sarah lied, her heart pounding in her chest. She had become adept at lying to her father, but each time she did, the guilt gnawed at her a little more. Richard nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. "You know, Sarah, I'm not a fool. I see things." Sarah swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around her fork. "I don't know what you mean," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Her father leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "I think you do. You've been sneaking out a lot lately, and don't think I haven't noticed where you've been going." The air in the room grew thick with tension, and for a brief moment, Sarah thought her father might say something more, might accuse her outright. But he didn't. Instead, he stood abruptly, leaving his half-eaten dinner on the table, and disappeared into the other room without another word. Sarah exhaled shakily, her mind racing. He knew. He had to know. She wasn't sure how much longer she could keep up the charade. The situation became even more precarious one evening when Sarah and Mr. Thompson were nearly caught. They had become careless in their desperation to spend time together, and one night, Richard decided to confront Mr. Thompson directly. He had planned to stop by the house under the guise of returning a borrowed tool, but when he arrived at Mr. Thompson's front door, something stopped him in his tracks. Through the window he could see them, Sarah and Mr. Thompson, sitting together on the couch. They were too close, their bodies angled toward each other in a way that left no room for doubt. Richard's heart pounded in his chest, the rage bubbling up inside him once again. He was just about to barge in when he heard a voice behind him. "Richard?" It was Mrs. Collins, one of the nosiest neighbors on the block. She stood on the sidewalk, watching him with a puzzled expression. "What are you doing here?" Richard forced a tight smile, his fists still clenched at his sides. "Just returning something," he said, gesturing to the toolbox in his hand. Mrs. Collins raised an eyebrow but said nothing more, moving along down the street. Richard took a deep breath, forcing himself to calm down. He couldn't lose control now, not yet. He had to bide his time, wait for the perfect moment to expose them both. Meanwhile, Sarah and Mr. Thompson's relationship continued to unravel. The weight of their secret was beginning to take its toll, not just on Sarah, but on Mr. Thompson as well. He had grown more anxious, more paranoid. He would often look out the windows, checking for anyone who might be watching. His hands trembled when he touched her as though he feared someone might burst through the door at any moment. "I don't know how much longer we can do this," Sarah whispered one night as they sat together, their hands intertwined. "I feel like I'm going to get caught every time I leave the house." Mr. Thompson nodded, his brow furrowed in concern. "I've been feeling the same way," he admitted, "but we have to be careful. If your father finds out—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. The unspoken threat hung in the air between them, heavy and suffocating. They both knew what Richard was capable of, and neither of them wanted to find out what would happen if he discovered the truth. The heat of summer had settled into the small town, making the air thick and stifling. Tempers ran high, tensions simmered, and the secret that Sarah and Mr. Thompson had fought so hard to keep hidden was becoming too difficult to bear. Every stolen moment between them felt like a ticking bomb, a countdown to disaster that neither of them could stop. Richard, too, was nearing his breaking point. His paranoia had grown into a dangerous obsession. He no longer cared about proof. He didn't need to catch them in the act to know what was happening. Every time Sarah left the house, every time she avoided his questions, it only confirmed what he'd already believed. He spent his nights pacing the house, replaying every interaction in his mind, every late-night disappearance. His sleep was fitful, his dreams haunted by images of betrayal and deceit. The once proud man was unraveling, and all it would take was one spark to set him off. That spark came on an unusually hot Saturday evening. The day had been unbearable, with the sun beating down relentlessly, and by the time night fell, the air was still thick with humidity. Sarah had told her father she was going out with friends, but Richard knew better. He watched as she left the house, her movements quick and nervous. This time he didn't follow her from a distance. He didn't sneak behind bushes or peer through windows. No, this time he went straight to Mr. Thompson's house. As Richard approached the front door, the anger he had been holding back for weeks finally boiled over. His mind was a whirlwind of rage and betrayal, and as he reached for the door, his hands trembled with barely contained fury. Without knocking, he shoved the door open and stormed inside. Inside, Sarah and Mr. Thompson were sitting on the couch, their conversation quiet and intimate. At the sound of the door crashing open, they both jumped, turning to see Richard standing in the doorway, his face contorted with anger. "Dad?" Sarah's voice was shaky, filled with fear and disbelief. She had never seen him like this before. The quiet, controlling man she had known all her life was gone, replaced by a furious stranger. "Get away from him," Richard spat, his voice low and dangerous. His eyes were locked on Mr. Thompson, burning with hatred. Mr. Thompson stood up slowly, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "Richard, listen." "I'm not listening to a damn word you have to say," Richard snarled, cutting him off. "You've been poisoning her, manipulating her. I trusted you." Sarah stood frozen between them, her heart pounding in her chest. She could see the wildness in her father's eyes, the way his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Dad, please, it's not like that. You don't understand. Not like that." Richard let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "I have seen the way he looks at you. I've seen the way you sneak out of the house at night to be with him." His voice grew louder, more frantic with every word. "You think I'm a fool. You think I haven't known this whole time." Mr. Thompson took a step forward, his voice calm but firm. "Richard, I never meant for any of this to happen, but it did, and Before he could finish, Richard lunged at him. The movement was sudden, violent, fueled by weeks of pent-up anger. He grabbed Mr. Thompson by the collar and shoved him against the wall, his face inches from his own. "You've ruined everything," Richard growled, his voice low and dangerous. "You've taken my daughter, my life, and twisted it all for your own gain." Mr. Thompson struggled against Richard's grip, trying to push him away. "Richard, stop. This isn't going to solve anything." But Richard wasn't listening. His mind was clouded with rage, and all he could see was the betrayal, the loss, the destruction of everything he had built. He swung his fist, landing a heavy punch across Mr. Thompson's face. Sarah screamed, rushing forward to try and pull her father away. "Dad, stop, please." But Richard was beyond reason. He shoved her aside, his attention solely focused on the man in front of him. Another punch, then another. Mr. Thompson tried to block the blows, but Richard was relentless. His fists connected again and again, until Mr. Thompson crumpled to the floor, blood dripping from his mouth and nose. In the chaos, something happened that none of them had anticipated. In the struggle, Richard had knocked over a lamp, and it shattered on the floor. One of the broken pieces, a jagged shard of glass, glinted in the dim light, catching Richard's eye. His hand reached for it almost instinctively, as if driven by some dark, primal urge. Before Sarah or Mr. Thompson could react, Richard drove the shard of glass into Mr. Thompson's side. For a moment there was silence. Mr. Thompson gasped, his body going rigid as the glass pierced his skin. Blood blossomed across his shirt, bright and red, spreading quickly. He looked down at the wound, then up at Richard, his eyes wide with shock. "What have you done?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper, her hands covering her mouth as she stared in horror at the scene unfolding in front of her. Richard stumbled back, dropping the shard of glass as though it had burned him. His eyes flicked between Sarah and Mr. Thompson, his chest heaving, his mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. Mr. Thompson collapsed to the floor, his breathing shallow, his face pale. The blood continued to flow, pooling around him, staining the hardwood floor. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, falling to her knees beside Mr. Thompson. "Oh my God, oh my God." Richard stood frozen, his mind blank. He hadn't meant to do it. He hadn't meant to kill him. It had just happened. He hadn't been thinking. He couldn't have been thinking. The reality of what he had done hit him like a tidal wave. His hands were trembling, slick with blood. His heart raced in his chest, panic gripping him like a vice. "We need to call someone," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "We need to call an ambulance." "No," Richard said suddenly, his voice sharp. "No one can know about this." Sarah looked up at him, her face pale, her eyes wide with disbelief. "What? What are you talking about? We can't let anyone find out," Richard said, his mind racing. "We'll go to prison. Both of us. Dad, he's dying. We have to call someone," Sarah cried, her hands shaking as she pressed them against Mr. Thompson's wound, trying to stop the bleeding. But Richard wasn't listening. His mind was already spiraling, his thoughts jumping ahead to what would happen if the police got involved. He saw himself in handcuffs, dragged away in front of the whole town. He saw Sarah's life ruined, her future destroyed. He couldn't let that happen. He had to protect her. He had to fix this. "We have to get rid of the body," Richard said, his voice eerily calm now. Sarah's eyes widened in horror. "What? Are you insane? We can't." "Listen to me," Richard snapped, grabbing her by the shoulders. "If anyone finds out about this, it's over. Do you understand? It's over for both of us." Sarah shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I can't do this." "You don't have a choice," Richard said firmly. "We're in this together now." In the end, Richard's plan was hasty and poorly thought out. They wrapped Mr. Thompson's body in a blanket and dragged him out to the car, working in panicked silence. Sarah was in shock, her mind numb as she followed her father's instructions. They drove out to the woods far from town and buried the body in a shallow grave. The drive back home was silent, the weight of what they had done hanging heavily between them. Sarah stared out the window, her hands still trembling, her thoughts racing. She couldn't believe what had just happened. It didn't feel real. It couldn't be real, but the blood on her hands said otherwise. The next few days were a blur of fear and paranoia. Sarah and Richard went about their lives as normally as they could, but the tension was palpable. Sarah could barely look at her father, and Richard was constantly on edge, jumping at every sound, every knock at the door. But it wasn't long before people started asking questions. Mr. Thompson's absence didn't go unnoticed. Neighbors wondered where he had gone, why his house was so quiet. The police were eventually called, and a missing person investigation was launched. Richard tried to stay calm, but the pressure was too much. Every day the fear of being caught gnawed at him, and he became increasingly paranoid. He watched the news obsessively, waiting for the moment when they would announce that Mr. Thompson's body had been found. And then, one day, it happened. A group of hikers stumbled across the shallow grave in the woods. The news spread quickly, and the police launched a full investigation. It didn't take long for them to connect the dots. Richard had been seen arguing with Mr. Thompson shortly before his disappearance, and Sarah's strange behavior didn't go unnoticed. The police arrived at their doorstep with a warrant, and the truth came spilling out. Richard tried to take the blame, but it was too late. Sarah broke down under questioning, confessing everything. The trial was quick. Richard was sentenced to life in prison for murder, while Sarah received a lighter sentence for her involvement in covering up the crime. But the damage had been done. Their lives were shattered, their family destroyed. As Sarah sat in her cell, staring at the cold, gray walls, she couldn't help but wonder how it had all gone so wrong. All she had wanted was to escape the suffocating life her father had built for her. But in the end, she had only traded one prison for another, and now there was no way out.